Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the seminar series, The Prospects of Criticism, part of our joint research project with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of the Art Seeking Understanding program. In this seminar, recorded on the 17th of January 2023, Professor Andrew Huddleston, Director of the Centre for Post-Kantian Philosophy at Warwick, presents work from his forthcoming book on art and religion. In his presentation, Professor Huddleston discusses Mark Rothko's claims, echoed in the experience of many viewers of his work, that his paintings communicate and express a kind of religious experience. Huddleston argues that these claims should be taken seriously, but that doing so requires us to rethink our understanding of abstractionism and formalism in modernist painting.
Greet you all and welcome our speaker today, of course, Andrew Huddleston. We've had a few apologies by email, but I'm glad to see those of you who are here joining us. We've been looking forward to this talk, and Andrew has, of course, been a regular attendee to our seminars, for which we're very grateful. Andrew, as you know, is Professor of Philosophy at Warwick, and he is the Director for the Centre of Post-Kantian Philosophy since a year or two back. He's just spent the autumn in Princeton and is now back in the UK, and we're really pleased to have him share his work with us in this forum here today. So without anything more to add, I'll just pass the word to Andrew.
Lovely, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. Let me try again to share my screen. So how many of you have been to the Rothko Chapel before? Anyone in the audience been to the Rothko Chapel? So I'll say a bit in just a minute to introduce it. But before I do that, let me contextualize this paper in my larger project. So this gives you just a sense of the space. And as I say, I'll say more about it in just a moment to introduce it. So the bigger project that I'm working on now looks at a common theme in the aesthetic theorizing of the 19th century, going into the 20th century. And some of you will have heard bits and pieces of this in different venues before. But it's the idea that art is somehow going to step in and play some of the roles of religion. And the book project that I'm working on now is an exploration of this theme, what this influential theme, but ultimately quite elusive idea amounts to. Now, I think as we look into this, we see there was never a single party line about how it is exactly that art's going to play this role. But there are a variety of different paths that get explored that reflect different conceptions of what the important core of religion really is. Just to give you an overview of what I plan to talk about in the book project, and this paper that I'm doing today is one of those chapters. I look to something that Jean-Marie Schaeffer calls the speculative theory of art in an initial chapter, which is the idea that art is somehow going to be a vehicle into ultimate metaphysics, an idea that he's quite critical of, and use that as a lens for looking at the early German romantics in particular, and push back somewhat against Schaeffer's reading. And then in another chapter, another one of the early chapters, I look at aestheticism, particularly in the context of England in the 19th century, and look at the idea that beauty, aesthetic values might somehow be put on a pedestal and be our highest values. Both of these options, the speculative theory of art as ultimate metaphysics, and aestheticism, seem to me to be possibilities in this agenda of a religion of art, but also not the sole path. And the way I set up the book project is to look at some alternative case studies showing us across a variety of artistic media, literature, music, poetry, the novel, within literature specifically, the visual arts, different paths that artists took, that theorists took, in seeing how art might potentially be a replacement for religion. And this chapter on Rothko is one of the chapters in the broader project. So now to introduce the chapel itself, it's situated in Houston, Texas, near the Menil collection, an important collection of modernist painting in Houston. It was a purpose-built structure that Rothko designed, painted 14 canvases for it, which are set up in the configuration indicated in this overhead view. So grouped into 3 triptychs and then these 5 standalone panels with a skylight above. The chapel itself is situated on this plaza that has another important work, Barnett Newman's Broken Obelisk, in the reflecting pool. So here it gives you a sense of the rather unassuming exterior of the chapel, and the Newman Broken Obelisk, which was a monument to Martin Luther King after his assassination, installed in this reflecting pool outside the chapel. It opened in 1971, and Rothko didn't live to see it open. He committed suicide the year before the chapel opened. But he had a mock-up of it in his studio in New York, and had carefully thought about how he wanted all of the canvases in it positioned and the light effects from above, and gave very detailed directions for how it was to be installed. So this gives you a sense. This is looking to the North Habs triptych. Now, just to give you a sense of the sort of religious air of the place, this is the curator and art historian Peter Sels says about it. Like much of Rothko's work, these murals really seem to ask for a special place apart, a kind of sanctuary where they may perform what is essentially a sacramental function. Perhaps, like medieval altarpieces, these murals can properly be seen only in an ambiance created in total keeping with their mood. So that just gives you a bit of a flavor of this religious air of these pieces. And here, another interesting quotation. This is from Dominique Dumenil, who was one of the funders of the Rothko Chapel, also a funder of the Menil collection right nearby, and herself an art historian at the University of Houston. So she says about Rothko, Rothko wanted to bring his paintings to the greatest poignancy of which they were capable. He wanted to be intimate and timeless. They embrace us without enclosing us. Their dark surfaces do not stop the gaze. They're warm too. There's a glow in the central panel. Rothko told me that he wanted to create the same opposition, the same tension that exists in Torcello's church, and more on that in just a moment with some pictures. The Last Judgment at the Door, the inviting and glorious apse. If there is such a message, we're grateful it is delivered without images. Images which were never acceptable to Jews and Muslims have become intolerable to us all today. Only in the exaltation of the Renaissance was it possible for Michelangelo to still represent God as a bearded man. But nobody is visually naive any longer. We're cluttered with images, and only abstract art can bring us to the threshold of the divine. So here she mentioned in that quotation the church on Torcello, the Santa Maria Assunta, and this was a particular inspiration for Rothko. So here the apse with the Madonna and Child on the right and the Last Judgment mosaic on the left. Now, Rothko's idea for this special place for his paintings grew out of a dissatisfaction with the conditions under which his work was to be viewed. So many of you will know the story. He'd been commissioned for a considerable sum to paint a series of murals for the Seagram building in New York and for the Four Seasons restaurant in it. But after he visited the restaurant, he came to have second thoughts. He was really distressed by the idea that his paintings would just be decoration for people having fancy meals. And he said, quotation here, "I hope to paint something that will ruin the appetite of every son of a bitch who ever eats in that room. If the restaurant would refuse to put up my murals, that would be the ultimate compliment." Now, eventually, he decided he wasn't even going to do that. He just withdrew from the project entirely and returned the deposit. And this is how the Seagram murals have ended up in the Tate in London. He did not give them to the Four Seasons restaurant to put up, and they're in their own special room in the Tate. Now, the classic Rothko, which we're we're all familiar with, presumably, this Seagram mural, one of them here on the left, these squidgy rectangular shapes with one or two colors typically, where the green and tangerine on red on the right-hand side that's in the Phillips collection in Washington. There are several canvases where Rothko decided on their arrangement in the specific space within the collection. In the Rothko Chapel, by contrast, there are a number of canvases, as in this triptych, that are just solid fields of color, and a few that have a very thin band of another color around the edge, a darker black around the edge, and the purple. The main palette is this sort of purple to black. And so going in an even more extreme direction than the classic Rothkos that most of us are familiar with. Now, when we reflect on Rothko's work, it throws up a lot of interesting philosophical and art historical questions around abstraction, around expression, around thematic content, if there is any such content in high modernist painting, and what our aesthetic experience of this is. And so I'm going to focus on just a few of these questions, and depending on how time goes, we may talk about both the abstraction and the expression bit, or maybe just the abstraction bit. But we'll begin with that, abstraction. Because on the one hand, abstraction seems completely crucial to Rothko's artistic project. But on the other hand, he rather surprisingly denied that he was an abstractionist. So why would he deny that, I want to ask? And what is abstraction in painting? And how is it significant for the project that he wanted to undertake? So here's the famous exchange. This is with the art critic Selden Rodman, where Rothko says, "I'm not an abstractionist." And Rodman says, "Well, you're an abstractionist to me. You're a master of color harmonies and relationships on a monumental scale. Do you deny that?" Rothko says, "I do. I'm not interested in relationships of color or form or anything else." Rodman, "Then what is it that you're expressing?" Rothko, "I'm interested in expressing the basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on. And the fact that lots of people break down and cry when confronted with my pictures shows that I communicate those basic human emotions. The people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them. And if, as you say, you're moved only by the color relationships, then you miss the point." So we'll be unpacking this in a little bit to follow, but important to note here that he's claiming that the people who are having this reaction, this extreme reaction to his paintings, are having a kind of religious experience. We'll try to understand what that might amount to, but also this significant denial here that he's an abstractionist. So why might he be denying this? So here, giving you a sense, looking to the North Apse triptych here, and the West triptych here over on the left side. So what is abstraction in painting? Well, this seems here to be a paradigm example. Kandinsky's color study, if anything is abstraction, this would seem to be, or Yves Klein's blue monochrome at an extreme. If anything is abstraction, this would seem to be as well. So what philosophically can we say about what abstraction in painting is to try to understand better this remark of Rothko's? Well, contrast it here very sharply with something that seems paradigmatically non-abstract, indeed just about as detailed figuratively as you can get, Van Eyck's The Arnolfini Wedding. So keep these in view and try to think about how we could understand what abstraction might be. Now, a natural starting point is that abstractions don't depict or pictorially represent anything. You have things depicted in great detail in the Van Eyck, and you might think as a starting point, you don't get that in the Kandinsky, but as is familiar from Volheim, for instance, this doesn't seem right. Abstract paintings can permit the sort of twofold awareness of the canvas and seeing in the canvas. So here we have an awareness of the canvas, but we have an awareness of things that we see in the canvas. Here are certain concentric circles of color, for example. So arguably, abstractions do depict or pictorially represent things, namely things seen in them. Here in the Kandinsky, certain shapes. And taking our example of the Yves Klein, as Elisa Calderola has argued, maybe even in the case of the abstract monochromes, those are pictorial representations, albeit a kind of limit case of it. Here we have represented just a solid field of color, but that's different. That pictorial representation of a solid field of color is different from the physical object of the painting, which has a reverse side and that's not colored and what have you. So here are another few examples to keep in view as we try to think theoretically about what this might be. So Malevich's suprematist painting, abstraction presumably, and Seurat's Sunday Afternoon on the island of Le Grand Jatte. So keep these two examples in view, and we will take up the idea that we've already toyed with a bit, that perhaps the abstract is somehow the non-figurative. But then what counts as the figurative, non-figurative divide relevant for this distinction? Well, here's what Kendall Walton says in Mimesis' Make-Believe. Figurative paintings point beyond themselves. Le Grand Jatte portrays people and objects distinct from the painting itself, fictitious ones perhaps, whereas suprematist painting merely depicts its own elements in a certain manner. Le Grand Jatte induces and prescribes imaginings about things external to the canvas. Suprematist painting merely calls for an imaginative rearrangement of the marks on its surface. So their classic statement of the figurative, non-figurative divide from Walton. Another suggestion from Michael Newell: abstract paintings, Newell says, allow us to recognize spatial relations between lines, shapes, etc. So here we see certain, in the suprematist painting, blue rectangles on top of the larger black rectangle, for instance. But it frustrates the perception, he says, of volumetric form or three-dimensional objects in space. We don't get that, but we could have other sorts of line or space relations. So here are two ways of trying to think about the abstract, non-abstract or abstract figurative divide. And of course, as Newell notes, and as many would agree, this would seem to be a spectrum concept. So things such as paintings such as Braque's Glass on a Table, analytical cubism would seem to be on the spectrum of abstraction. So not fully abstract, but not exactly figurative either. Or more on the figurative side, but still on the spectrum of abstraction. The paintings of Mont Saint-Victoire, which Cézanne painted many, many times, this one at the more abstract end of the spectrum of his works. Now, to Newell's point about frustrating the perception of volumetric space, this is, of course, not a great work of art, but it's a nice philosophical example. Michael Thomset's Mondrian 3D, which seems to me abstract, but to allow the perception of volumetric form, and for that to be indeed quite an important part of this work. So I think although these suggestions from Newell and from Walton, they have good intuitive plausibility and they're onto something important, I don't think either of these accounts is right. So contra Newell, it seems to me that there are three-dimensional abstractions, the Mondrian 3D being one example. And contra Walton, it seems to me that abstractions can point beyond themselves, for instance, to symbolic or to expressive content, while still not being figurative. Now, in line with Newell and with Walton, there is an important art critical and art historical tradition that associates abstraction with flatness, or good abstraction anyway, with the primacy of opticality. So you get this in Greenberg or in a different version in Fried. But I think all of these views, both the views in analytical aesthetics and the views in this particular strand of the art critical tradition, they all seem to suggest that abstractionism is a kind of formalism. And that's the conflation that I want to press on here and question. Now, even as critical terms, abstractionism, formalism, they don't seem to me to have clear or univocal meanings. But I'm going to try to regiment them a little bit to explain the sense in which Rothko, despite this resisted self-description of abstractionism, could still be said to be an abstractionist, despite himself, but not a formalist. I think what he was actually trying to deny was that he was a formalist. And the abstractionism and formalism had been so conflated in the critical discourse, he denied he was an abstractionist, but I think it really doesn't make sense to deny that. Now, even without a clear account of what abstraction in painting is, arguably Rothko seems a paradigm case of what we mean by it. In the chapel canvases, there are no recognizable figurative representation, so it's at an extreme of abstraction. But in asking this other question, whether the work is formalist, we're instead asking, how should it be understood? How should it be experienced? Is aesthetic focus just to be on features such as shape and, using formalism somewhat expansively, color? Well, the formalist will say yes, whereas Rothko will say no. And that's why I think he's not a formalist. So when he says in that conversation with Rodman that he's not an abstractionist, I think that's actually better captured by formalism. And Rodman, on the flip side, he's sharing that tendency that I've pointed to already of Greenberg, of Fried, of Walton, and others to conflate abstractionism with formalism and to assume that if it's abstract art, then it's to be appreciated in purely formalist terms. And I think that was the key thing that Rothko wanted to deny. So just to give us a better sense of what formalism might be, here are two different versions. Here's the first one, what we might call strict formalism. According to the person I'm calling the strict formalist, the focus of aesthetic experience should be on significant form. So here in Clive Bell, in his 1914 book, Art Paradigm, example of this, or earlier in the mid-19th century, Hanslich on music and on the musically beautiful, thinking of significant form as the focus of aesthetic experience. So the thought here for the strict formalist would be, form sets the faculties in motion, it occasions an intrinsically valuable aesthetic experience, but art isn't about anything at all, or to the extent that it appears to be, and this is Bell's line, and even if it is a figurative painting, that's not of real aesthetic significance. What's of aesthetic significance is its significant form. So that I take to be the core commitment of strict formalism. Now, Rothko is deeply opposed to this sort of approach. He says, this is in a letter that he co-writes to the New York Times in the late 1940s. There's no such thing as a good painting about nothing. The subject is crucial, and only that subject matter is valid, which is timeless and tragic. So we might not agree with the specifics of that sentiment, but the idea that subject matter is important, that is vital to how Rothko's thinking about his project. Now, contrasted with this strict formalism, we might also describe a view called modernist formalism. Now, that takes a cue from strict formalism and its conception of aesthetic experience, but it adds to that the purpose of art isn't just to give us an intrinsically valuable experience for its own sake. It's also about a reflection on art itself. This is a kind of characteristically Greenbergian idea. So the modernist formalist will disagree with the strict formalist on the question of whether art is about anything. The strict formalist says no, the modernist formalist says yes, but it's about itself. So on Greenberg's view, for instance, it will be exploring the flatness of the medium or acting as a self-critique of the form. So it'll be about something, but it'll be about its own form and own capabilities. So here's a way of separating abstractionism and formalism. Whereas abstractionism has to do roughly with the descriptive issue, the extent to which there is or is not figurative depiction, formalism is a normative theory. It makes claims about what aesthetic experience should be like, namely focused on form, and where art's value or significance lies, in the experience of form or in reflection on its own form in the Greenberg case. Now, however implausible strict formalism is as a theory of art and aesthetic experience as such, it's often thought, well, okay, that at least works well for the main strands of pictorial modernism. And modernist formalism, more narrowly tailored to try to explain that and try to explain its art historical significance. But I think it's quite misleading when it comes to the work of Rothko and to the more, as we might describe them, spiritualist of the modernists, people like Mondrian, Kandinsky, Malevich, Newman. who talk in a very metaphysical and religious register about their work, but that these formalist interpretations tend to soft pedal. I think because they find these effusive metaphysical outpourings off message from the line that they want to press about the onward march of modernism and the primacy of opticality, the exploration of the flatness of the medium, and so on. So in summary, Rothko, I want to suggest, was an abstractionist, despite denying that particular label, but he was not a formalist in either of those two senses that I've just distinguished. And I think that's crucial for understanding the core of his project, as well as its place in art history. And so too, I think, for understanding the broadly religious aspiration of his project. And that's what connects it to my broader project in this book. In our present historical conditions, he thinks, religious experience is going to be best occasioned not through figurative representations, not through God as the bearded man, but through what Pache Rothko we might describe as abstraction. So back to that quotation from Dominique de Menil as well. So abstraction, importantly though, in Rothko's case, is supposed to be highly expressive. It's not just supposed to be contemplation of formal elements or exploration of its medium. So let me say briefly a bit about expression rather, in abstract art, and then I'll wrap things up. So we have a broader philosophical question of what it is for art to be expressive of something, an emotion, for instance, or some other sort of quality. This is discussed the most in the philosophy of music literature, where the emphasis tends to be on emotional expression, but there are also other sorts of abstract characteristics that could potentially be expressed as well. Now, many of you may be familiar with this literature. Many of the simplest, most intuitive theories face some major difficulties. So that you might have the thought, well, the expressive quality is somehow inherited from the artist's mental state, or it's on the reception side, it's what is evoked in an audience who's appreciating the work. For reasons we can discuss if you want to in the Q&A, or that you probably already know amply well, neither of those theories looks like it's going to work very well, even if we just talk about the expression of emotion. If we move into any of the other abstract qualities, it looks like they're complete non-starters. And in the first instance, that's because the expressive quality is a feature of the work itself, not a feature of what it evokes in an audience, or a feature of the artist's mental state, though, of course, a story is to be told about how it gets that quality and how an audience recognizes and reacts to that quality. But the expressive quality is, in the first instance, a feature of the work itself. But this expressive character, of course, cuts across both figurative and abstract works. So figurative works have expressive characteristics, and arguably abstract works do too, as in the case of Rothko and many others. So here we have no trouble thinking that this painting, Titian's Assumption of the Virgin, that's in the Frari Church in Venice, that painting is expressive. Here we have a figure depicted in the painting, Mary, with a very evocative expression. But we also think, in addition to just what some depicted figure in the painting is expressing, there could be something like expression in the work as a whole. But here, straightforwardly, we think in figurative painting, there is kind of expression to be found. Now, getting now a bit closer in spirit to Rothko, think about German Romanticism in painting, Friedrich's Monk by the Sea. So here we don't see the expression of any figure, but it is a highly expressive painting, this sort of seascape, as so many of Friedrich's works are. Or here, think about Turner's Evening Star. We do have a figure in this painting, but the expressive quality is not an expressive quality that we read off of the figure, but that we get from the depicted scene as a whole. Or another Friedrich example, the Sea Coast in Moonlight. This is one of the late Friedrichs. Here we don't see any depicted figure at all, but a very expressive painting. And think of that in connection with Rothko. and think of the sort of continuity here between these works. Now, what would it be for Rothko's works to be expressive of tragedy, ecstasy, doom, those things that he mentions in that quotation we looked at earlier? Well, he calls these the basic human emotions. I mean, I don't think he could be taken at his word necessarily there. That seems to be wrong in the case of at least one of those, maybe two of those, that those are somehow basic human emotions. Not clear to me that doom is even an emotion, let alone a basic human emotion. And similarly with tragedy, an ecstasy perhaps doesn't seem to be, even if it is an emotion, a basic human emotion. Now, could Rothko's works be expressive of some emotions or conditions, if not those, perhaps? Even if they are, it's important to remember that that needn't be in an information vacuum. So audiences who are familiar with art historical conventions are going to be better positioned to pick up on the expressive register than audiences who know nothing about the history of art at all. So, for instance, the thought that the ecstasy of redemption will be associated with the triptych that's on the central panel in the north wall of the Rothko chapel. So thinking about the usual orientation of a chapel where the apse would be and the indication of redemption there, you bring that sort of art historical knowledge to bear and can interpret the Rothko much more easily than someone who doesn't have any of that knowledge. But it might also be thought that they're expressive of something ineffable, if not of these states in particular. So Rothko does use these particular terms, but perhaps he's just casting around for something to capture this more ineffable sort of experience. Now, there are three sorts of questions to distinguish here. One is whether his paintings evoke these emotions. Now, do they evoke things like ecstasy? Well, presumably, yes, for some viewers anyway, and other sorts of emotions. Another question, can they express or convey these emotions? Ecstasy, tragedy, whatever those are the ones that he cites. Maybe we want to slot others in there. Well, that's a more complicated question, especially when we think about how might it be that they convey these determinate emotions in particular. And a third question, can they be about these emotions or conditions? That's a difficult question as well, and a step further still. So even if they could express those things, could they be about those things? Now, notice we can ask those same sorts of questions about figurative painting too, because even if it's figurative painting, expression and aboutness, those both outstrip what's figuratively depicted. So just going back to one of our examples, the Arnolfini Bride, the Van Eyck, there's very complex depiction, but the aboutness of the painting goes well beyond what's depicted because it depends on a highly symbolic and elusive register. So you'd still have a lot of working out to do once you worked out what's pictorially depicted when it comes to thinking about what the painting is about or what the painting might express. Now, why think the paintings are successfully expressing things such as ecstasy or doom, or think there's any determinate content here at all, or indeed even some kind of ineffable alternative? You might worry that there's a kind of emperor's new clothes problem here, that they thought that there's some deep inaccessible content that we're nonetheless still somehow able to access. But I think the key test, as indicated in something that I said already, is not whether these putative expressions are going to be readily recognizable by your average first-time viewer, because by that metric, most of the iconographic symbolism in art history would be disallowed. But still, I think there's going to be puzzlement about how anyone could successfully retrieve anything of any sort of determinacy from these works. And now to my wrapping up with my larger project here. Even if the paintings did successfully evoke or convey these sorts of grand emotions, why would this lead to or be a form of religious experience, as Rothko appears to suggest? That question I'll take up in just a moment and conclusion. But it's sort of an ambitious thought that we could keep on track at the same time is what Menil appears to think, Dominique de Menil, that Rothko might actually provide some kind of ineffable insight into the divine or the transcendent. Now, of course, many of us are probably skeptical about this, but the views on the plausibility of that probably track one's views on the plausibility of the background theological matters more generally. So if you did subscribe to the sort of theology that Menil does, and Menil, as I don't think I mentioned, was a devout Roman Catholic, then you might think that Rothko could do this equally well, put one in touch with the divine or the transcendent as figurative religious painting could. Now, it's also important to stress here, and this is significant for reflecting on how Menil regards this work. Art is not trying to be a replacement for religion in Rothko's case, or just that anyway. Through the very generality of his program, it's aiming to reach the devout as well, and reaching across traditions to a kind of common syncretistic core that they share. So speaking to both the faithful and to more secular people. And as Menil points out, you might think that not just could this do as well as standard figurative religious art in getting us to the divine, it might in fact do better. It might be able to, in this time period, where, as Menil says, we're cluttered with images, be able to capture insights that are not well captured in words or in pictorial depiction. So you might think it can do better, or at least equally well or differently in expressing the divine or the transcendent than some more specific images or doctrines that one gets in different religious traditions. So thinking about here the Ribera, where the Holy Spirit is depicted as a dove. So why think this is doing any better at conveying the divine or the transcendent compared with Rothko, for instance? Now, could the experience of Rothko be a religious experience for those who don't subscribe to some more specific theological outlook? Why would that sort of designation still make any sense at all? Well, there's a lot of debate to be had around this very tricky word religious and what it's supposed to mean in this extended sense. But at least we might be able to say that it's quasi-religious in having some important similarities with the character of religious experience as such, being solemn, being profound, contemplative, mysterious. But putting that particular issue aside, many won't or can't have that sort of powerful aesthetic experience Rothko aimed to evoke, or anything we might think of as in the order of religious or even quasi-religious experience. But it should be added, if you're put off by the quasi-religiosity, you can still take a formalist approach to the works, have an aesthetically rewarding and valuable experience of the chapel looking at it through that sort of lens. But I think if you did, you would be missing the most important dimension of what Rothko was trying to do with this project, for better or for worse, aesthetically. So with that, I will draw to a close. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Wonderful talk and plenty of points of connection with our project. But we've got about half an hour for discussion. So who would like to go first? Vid.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was super interesting. I'm looking forward to the book. I guess I wanted to, so towards the end, you said that Rothko might be expressing just as well or differently or in some way analogously certain possibly religious or certainly certain insights, maybe even propositions in this way that's analogous to what's happening in figurative painting of the kind of Roman Catholic paintings from the Renaissance. And I guess I wanted to press a little bit on how much the kind of metaphysics that one has actually affects the story of how these images are supposed to relate the content. So I think it's, I'm not clued up enough on the art history here, but I think a lot of the abstractionists who are thinking about their work in in spiritual terms, like subscribed to what we would now call New Age religions, right? Like they were attracted to theosophy, to Christian Science, even, and so I wonder whether it matters that metaphysics says something like the divine, or in other words, the metaphysical truth is not that the divine is Holy Ghost or something that you could even capture in propositional terms. So in what ways does it matter? If you want to say that abstraction can picture some metaphysical truth, do you have to have a specific view of what the divine is? If that makes sense. Do you have to be a mystic?
That does. Yeah. Well, I think Rothko is interestingly different from that, some of the other central figures in this more spiritualist strand of modernism, in that he doesn't seem to be committed to any metaphysics, however vague. So, Kandinsky, Malevich, definitely more paid-up subscribers to theosophy in one form or another. But Rothko doesn't seem to be a subscriber to that. He's much more interested in the kind of sublime emotional evocation or expression in the work. And so I think his project stands independently of any particular metaphysics. Now, you could interpret it in the way that Menil does and think that it's congruent with anyway with the basic metaphysical orientation of Roman Catholicism, and that it's simply expressing or somehow indicating that without the use of images, without the use of any sort of figurative depiction. But I think that's not how Rothko saw his own project. I think he didn't subscribe to any of that, and I think it's important for thinking about his project too, in that there's not anything that he's trying to pictorially depict or anything of that sort. It's more focused on an expressive register that he thinks can be conveyed through the work, and an expressive register that reaches people who don't subscribe to any particular metaphysical outlook, whether Roman Catholicism or theosophy or some other mystical strand as well, if the mystical strand is a metaphysical one and not just about a emotive experience.
Good, thank you, Bid. Guy.
Thanks very much. That was super interesting, Andrew, and very clear. Really nice to have so many illustrations as well. I had a couple of questions. One is in relation to the concept of symbolism, which came up only very briefly in relation to Van Eyck's marriage of the Arnold Feeney, where you said that adds to the concept of what it is basically to see a figurative or a fiction of something, and how the concept of symbolism feeds into the concept of abstraction, because obviously many abstract painters were consciously, both consciously as creating the art, but also their audiences or their public were very conscious in decoding these symbols. So I think of Miro, I think of someone like Hilma af Klint, who's prominent at the moment. That there seems to be in many understandings of abstraction the fact that there's no prescription against symbolism. Obviously, there is in a certain critical strand of abstractionism in that sense. So that'd be one question. The other is really just a reaction to the general line of argument in the book, or what I take to be the line of argument in this very coherent but necessarily brief sketch of the content, is that, are you really kind of claiming very plausibly, I think, that Rothko is basically best understood within the context of Romanticism, that this kind of aesthetic experience which is bound up in a sense of absorption in a visual field, whatever one takes to be the content of the visual field. That there is a value simply in a kind of visual or other aesthetic experience which is consciously presented as breaking down possibilities for decoding things. So again, symbolism, but where it's defeating the viewer's tendency to synthesize the field in terms of concepts and even determined emotions. So those would be two.
Yeah, let me take the second one first. I guess I do want to draw out important affinities between Rothko and Romanticism, but I wouldn't want to situate him or say that he's best understood in the context of Romanticism, because I think the commitment to abstraction is so important in a way that would just be alien in the Romantic tradition. I mean, it's there are elements of proto-abstraction there, but I think that's so crucial to Rothko's project and situates him firmly within a modernist frame, even if the critical categories that he draws on have important affinities with the Romantics, categories like the sublime, for instance, but which you get in people like Newman, who are firmly in a modernist tradition, but drawing on this sort of Romantic vocabulary of the sublime, for instance. Yeah, when it comes to symbolism, I find it a quite tricky category to work with when I have a much clearer grasp of it in the case where something is figuratively depicted and we have a clear sort of kind of background knowledge about what the symbolic register is, that we know, okay, if it's a dog, it's fidelity. If it's, the various things we could take from the Arnolfini Bride, and we have that kind of background context. In the case of the Rothko, the thing that it's pointing to seems so elusive and abstract. I find it hard even to think about it as a symbol, but maybe it is a symbol in a certain way, just in this a symbol for something highly abstract. But I find symbolism harder to work with in the case of where first of all there's not a kind of straightforward, even if there's a lot of interpretive work to be done, but straightforward sort of context of interpretation to work out what the symbolism is, but also where there's not the thing that's doing the symbolizing being kind of readily able to be read off of the work in a way where we could recognize the orange or the cherries or the mirror or the dog in the Arnolfini Bride.
Thanks very much.
Good, thank you both. John.
Yeah, oh, that was lovely. Thank you so much. I hope the question isn't unclear. I think what I'm going to suggest is that the one thing you might develop a little bit is a really precise account of what abstraction consists in. So in poetics, or like the philosophy of music, for example, when one invokes abstraction, there's a process that they're identifying. You even see this in Clive Bell, if we recall that weird metaphysical hypothesis, right? Yeah. That what an artist does is abstract the form from the things and stuff of life and somehow show us that form in the work of art. Or going back to Schopenhauer in the philosophy of music, you have a tradition of people arguing that music expresses abstract emotion, that is abstracting from actual felt instances of emotion, something about their nature, their quality, right? Or in poetry, we're abstracting forms of meaning from actual everyday language uses and showing us something about language. But it has a much more limited scope in that case in terms like formalism, right? And it calls on us to say something really precise about a kind of artistic technique, a technique that consists in abstraction. I'm not sure if that's a question or just a side point I wanted to.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that comes out there is whether we should model abstraction in terms of abstraction from. And that, so I mean, we could think of abstraction as kind of stripping away certain elements to try to get to the core of something. And I think that's one route to thinking about abstraction, but I'm not sure it's the only one. When we think about abstraction as a particular kind of particular school of or tradition in the visual arts. Sometimes it's doing that, and I think we see as if we think of Cézanne or someone as on the path to abstraction, that sort of a model looks really good. That where it looks like we're somehow abstracting away from the particularities, we're getting to those more fundamental forms or shapes that are behind things. And so I think it works really well there, or perhaps in the analytical cubism case, so I think that's a bit more difficult. But when I think about Rothko, I wonder, what is he abstracting from? And so I find it harder to work with in his case compared to, say, the Cézanne case.
Good, thank you. John, did you want to follow up on that? Were you pleased with the answer?
I was very pleased. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Hannah.
Thank you, Andrew, for the talk. It was really stimulating, even at 8 a.m. So
thanks for coming at 8 a.m.
So I've been thinking about this connection that you draw towards the end between abstraction and religious feeling, or just religion in general. And a suggestion that came to mind was something about attention being the price that we have to pay for both. And so there might be something about kind of the demand for attention or devotion that's important. And so the figure I was thinking about was Schleiermacher, who talks about religious feeling as a kind of concern, or a feeling as religious feeling as a kind of preoccupation with the ultimate concern, right? And so it's something that we think is like a bottom line, the only thing that matters. And that Schleiermacher came to mind from the Rothko restaurant anecdote, which I find fascinating, right? He didn't want his art to be something that people glance at while eating. Like, he wanted this kind of total absorption into it, like what would be required in a Rothko chapel, right? And so I thought there might be a kind of parallel between abstract art and religion, in the sense that, you know, it's not something that you ought to multitask about, right? These are some things of like ultimate concern. It requires a lot of attention or even interpretation and engagement. I mean, so think about how the Bible's full of parables that require a lot of unpacking, right? So it needs this kind of sustained relationship with it. And so I'm not sure if I want to say that like abstract art might require more attention per se. I guess that's where I'm unsure about, but these parallels just came to me as a potential place where there might be a similarity. And so so I don't know, I guess that's a suggestion. Like, what do you think about that? Like, does that commit us to things that we don't want to say about abstract art per se?
Yeah, no, I guess I'm sympathetic to that idea. And I think that was why Rothko was so concerned that he create a particular space that's set apart from the everyday, where people could have those experiences of absorption and contemplation that they couldn't even get in an ordinary museum, where they're going, you know, from one work to another in their tour groups, and all of the sort of things that even in the relatively hushed space of a museum make contemplation or that kind of absorbed attention more difficult. I mean, I think he also had in mind, in addition to that, just the effect of being totally surrounded by these canvases, and wanted to capitalize on that sort of effect. But I think it also had, as I began by saying, had quite a bit to do with the allowing for that experience of contemplation or absorption that sets you apart from the everyday, which is one way of thinking about the sacred versus the profane. That you're in something that is specially separate from the rest of the world and the rest of life. And I think he wanted to try to tap into that. On Schleiermacher, I mean, I think he's really very interesting for thinking about this whole tradition because of the way that he reconceptualizes what the core of religious experience is about, that it's not ultimately about the particular cosmology and metaphysics that Christianity is committed to if you look at the doctrine, but it's about a certain kind of experience, in particular a kind of, as he calls it, following the Kantian term intuitive, a kind of intuitive experience. And it's something that is grasped through feeling, where those are the central characteristics of religious experience. And I think that's very influential for the early German Romantics, thinking about what religious or spiritual experience will be like. They take that kind of Schleiermachian line about what it is and think the ins and outs of doctrine about the Trinity and eternal life in heaven and an omnipotent God. Those are neither here nor there. It's about a certain kind of intuitive feeling. And I think Rothko's very much kind of in that direction.
Great. Thank you.
Good. I'm going to squeeze myself in for a question. Thanks, Andrew. I really enjoyed that, and I particularly took note at the beginning of your paper. I think just before the Dominique de Menil quote, when there was another quote which kind of asked us, how are we to look at this painting? What is there to see there? And you mentioned this very broad expressive register. I think you used that expression. And of course, in a way, the possibilities are endless, what we can find. And of course, also in terms of the critical language that we can apply to a work like this, which would then, be a clue, perhaps at best, to what we can perceive in the painting. But I also thought about what you said about abstraction, and I think I can see why Rothko would resist that label for the reasons that came up just a few moments ago. I think, the sense in which abstraction is about abstracting away from something or synthesizing from something. There is something out there, and somehow one simplifies it, one distills it, one ends up with something, neater, clearer, and that doesn't seem to be exactly what Rothko's doing here, because in that sense, at least as I understand it, he wants to represent, something of a spiritual nature, the essence of which lies precisely in this meeting of, threat and intimacy, or tragedy and closeness, and the spectrum of the large emotions. It's kind of where they meet that we find the nature of that spirit. I'm just kind of speculating now, right? That in a way is what he is representing. So does not talk really of abstracting away from something in the sense of simplifying it, right? But then my question to you is really, and I can see that thanks to your talk more clearly now. So thank you. And that, of course, dissolves this tension between the figurative and the non-figurative in this interesting way. But could you do this with anything other than this kind of subject matter? I mean, could you have this mode of representation for anything else than, the source of all life, or God, or this kind of spiritual subject matter? It seems to me that there's a risk that wouldn't be possible. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me it has the most plausibility, to the extent that it has any plausibility at all, with this sort of exalted spiritual subject matter. If you picked some mundane worldly thing and claimed that your work was about that, it would strain credulity even more than this does, oddly. And maybe that's simply because if you have something straightforward and worldly that you're claiming to depict, why not do it in a figurative way? Whereas if your goal is to convey or express something like this, you don't really have anything figurative at your disposal unless it's symbolic, back to the symbolic point, and you're conveying the Holy Spirit via a dove, or you're conveying heaven in what's essentially a symbolic way, or the Last Judgment in a symbolic way. So I think there is, in that sense, a kind of natural alliance between this sort of highly abstract content and the means of representation that someone like Rothko is drawing upon, where there would also be that sort of natural alliance between fairly mundane things and ordinary figurative depiction of those sorts of mundane things. And I think what the possibility of pictorial modernism opens up is that we might get to those very abstract things, not via figurative and symbolic depiction, but in this, in some sense, more direct way via abstraction.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Tsaki, did you have a comment or a question? I felt like there was a hand that went up and then it went down again. Is that right?
It wasn't mine, but we are over time, so I thought I'd pass it. So
let's see how if Andrew is willing to answer it. But anybody who needs to go, like Eileen's already gone and Hans needs to go, should of course feel free to go. But Tsaki, if you want to just raise it.
Yeah, very quickly, it seems to me that this was I really enjoyed this. I've had strong experiences with Rothko's paintings, so it was very interesting for me to see how you're trying to articulate that. It seems to me that the challenge for someone like Rothko is to somehow establish an experiential distinction between a religious experience and some experience of the divine, of the sublime, I'm sorry. Or something like the oceanic. All of these are experiences, or the Nietzsche's Dionysian of being somehow falling into some undifferentiated sense in which you are somehow transcending the borders of the self, etc., failing to find words. These are overlapping conceptualizations, but they're not distinctly theological. So it seems to me that if he wants to create religious art, he somehow has to say, okay, this is just the sublime, or this is just the oceanic. All of that was available for him at the time it was drawing this. Yeah. And this is distinctly about a religious experience. And I was wondering if you can conceptualize that special uniqueness.
Yeah, well, I think a lot is going to turn on how expansively the term religious is used here. And I think as Rothko's using it in that exchange with Selden Rodman, he's using it very expansively. So the religious doesn't need to be associated with the God of monotheism or with any particular doctrines. And I think he would allow that experience of the sublime or the oceanic or the Nietzschean Dionysian, those count as religious in this expansive sense that he's using it. And in fact, he was a very enthusiastic reader of Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy. And I think that idea of the Dionysian figures strongly in what he's thinking about. And the sublime is something that he mentions quite a bit as well. And I think he would think of those as in the broad sense he's using the term religious experience, forms of religious experience. He wouldn't think that it needs to be in a more conventional or doctrinal mold.
Good. Anybody else wants to just add something very briefly before we go? No. Oh, Irene.
Hi, just very briefly. I was, there was a quote from Rothko, I think, that he said that the emotions that he wanted to express were basic emotions. And I think that you were a bit like suspicious that those were actually that basic. And I think I agree with you. And I think it would be like maybe interesting to know what kind of emotions you think are connected to abstract art. So making also the connection with religious experiences, one might think that aesthetic, religious experiences or intellectual experiences are more connected to the non-basic ones, but to the secondary or the non-standard emotions. So those that require like more cognition, those are associated less with bodily reactions. And I just want to know what you thought about that.
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is I don't see emotion as necessarily the central category of what's expressed. I think that there's a kind of natural tendency we have to think about it in those terms, but I think the content of the expression could be something non-emotional to which we respond emotionally. And I think in Rothko's own examples that he gives tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and it seems to me that two of those are not actually emotions. Tragedy and doom is sort of borderline, but I think doom is something you respond to with a sense of foreboding, but it's not itself an emotion. And similarly with tragedy, you have a powerful reaction to tragedy, but tragedy is a condition. And I think similarly with the sublime is something that you have a powerful emotional reaction to, but it is itself a condition that you're responding to. And I think in the first instance, we should think about the content of abstract expression in terms of states to which we then respond emotionally, but not the emotions themselves as the content of what's expressed. It could be emotions too, but we shouldn't kind of artificially narrow our kind of classification to think that it will just be emotions.
Good. With that, let's all thanks Andrew again for sharing his work with us and engaging in conversation with us. Before you go, I just wanted to say very briefly that we have we have several seminars lined up. Next seminar is on Thursday, 9th of February.
Yes, thanks so much. So 5 o'clock on the 9th of February, and it will be another of these interview format meetings. And so Alex Ross is the classical music critic of the New Yorker since at least 15 years ago, and the author of one of now sadly very few best-selling books about classical music called The Rest Is Noise, which came out about 14 years ago, I think. And he's published a few books since then. Anyway, that should be good value. And then looking forward to the rest of the term, we have Irena Martinez-Maran who's going to talk on the 2nd of March. And later in the term, we have Eileen John is coming and Vid Simoniti, both of whom were visible today, which is nice. And some other spots which should be confirmed very soon. As always, do check the website if you want to either see old seminars which have been recorded or find out what's coming along. But yeah, thanks from all of us to all of you for a great start to the term. Wonderful.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for all the good questions.
Thanks, Andrew.
All right. Bye-bye. Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching this recorded seminar in the series The Prospects of Criticism, part of the Templeton-funded research project, Knowledge, Perception and the Prospects of Criticism. If you'd like to find out more about the project, to learn about upcoming events or watch other recordings in the seminar series, please go to our website www.knowledgeperceptioncriticism.com.